Hey guys, you've no doubt heard over the last couple days the hubbub that's been taking place about bump stocks. The ATF is on the verge of releasing their final ruling, which will essentially make bump stocks a machine gun, officially reclassify. And I'm being careful not to say the term making bump stocks illegal, because technically they're not making them illegal. They are reclassifying them as machine guns, which are a regulatable device per the NFA. I know that can get a little confusing, so that's my simple way of simplifying as quickly and easily as I can. So they're technically not making them illegal. Just understand that. However, it will make, I don't know, essentially 500,000 people felons if they don't destroy their brand new machine guns that they have, which there's all kind of other litigation that can happen after that, because the average person like you and I cannot manufacture machine guns anyway. And if by the stroke of a pen by the ATF, we suddenly all become owners of 500,000 machine guns per their classification, a little bit different. I want to go into some of the details about that right now. First of all, what I want to do is I want to go over with you guys the actual letter that I hold in my hand here from June 7th of 2010 from the ATF's own office. This comes from John R. Spencer, the chief of the firearms technology branch, chief of the firearms technology branch. That's the branch that anybody who wants to have a new item that's approved by the ATF goes to the technology branch. They test the samples and they determine whether or not they are regulatable, or if the ATF in fact has jurisdiction or not over them. In short, this letter that they sent out confirmed by the ATF's own wording that they have no jurisdiction over bump stocks. Now, I hate to say I told you so, but I'm on record a year ago after the Las Vegas shooting of saying that, and I called heat for this. I'm on record as saying the Second Amendment does not apply to bump stocks, because bump stocks are an accessory. They are a part. They are not a firearm. The ATF has no jurisdiction over non-firearms. They have no jurisdiction over parts. They don't have jurisdiction over bump stocks any more than they have jurisdiction over optics. You follow me? This letter confirms that. In their own words, it confirms that. And I'm gonna put this on screen so you can read it, but I'm gonna highlight two sections of it real quick so that you understand where I'm coming from. They say in the second paragraph, the stock has no automatically functioning mechanical parts or springs and performs no automatic mechanical function. All right, I'm going to skip down a couple of sentences to where they say, accordingly, we find that the bump stock is a firearm part and is not regulated as a firearm under Gun Control Act or the National Firearms Act. There are some pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment guys out there, and I don't doubt their enthusiasm and their desire to protect the Second Amendment, but some guys that have vehemently disagreed with me over the last year when I came out and said, I've had people talk about not ever following me anymore and not wanting to have anything to do with me, because I came out and said the ATF does not have jurisdiction over these things. We should not be allowing them. We shouldn't be saying, ATF, you can't ban these, because that's making the insinuation that they can ban them. They have no jurisdiction over bump stocks, so they can't ban them or they can't unban them. That's like saying a police officer can come into your house and tell you what you can or cannot eat. They do not have jurisdiction to do that. So by asking them to come in your house and monitor what you're eating, you're giving them, you're ceding over that jurisdiction. And that was my point all along to all these pro-Second Amendment guys that were like, no compromise, no compromise. Shall not be infringed means shall not be infringed. Yeah, I get it. I get it. But we've already let the ATF come into our house and regulate all of our items now. There's already an acting ATF that, to me, and most of you out there will agree, they're already overreaching. Why would we cede them something else? Why would we give them something else? Why would we suggest that they have any jurisdiction over? I understand you were suggesting that they don't ban them, but you're giving them the power to have jurisdiction over them by saying they have that right to not ban them. Telling them they have the right to not ban them also tells them that they have the right to ban them, because you're giving them jurisdiction over them. That's the problem I had all along, and that's the thing I'd been saying all along. The point I was trying to make is once we allow the ATF to start including parts, which you just did, in their little realm of their world, their scope of things that they can regulate, I'm telling you guys, listen to me, hear what I'm about to say. As soon as there is some kind of a shooting where a guy uses a scope to shoot someone at 1,000 yards, somebody will call for a regulation on scopes and optics. Do not think that I'm crazy here. I know what I'm talking about. And guess what? Everybody that was okay with the ATF having jurisdiction over these bump stocks has themselves to blame for allowing the ATF to now have jurisdiction over scopes and not letting you have a scope that can see anything over, say, 250 or 300 yards. Because you know what they'll say? That's not a just kill for hunting. You don't need anything that can see beyond this point because it's not fair at that point to the animal, or they're going to say that it's not, I don't know what term they use, but it's not a, I guess, a justifiable shot to take because you could potentially miss the animal and the animal could run off wounded, okay? Dude, that's what we're going to be up against. We just opened the door to the ATF having jurisdiction over something that they, by their own admission, are telling you, leave us alone about these bump stocks. We don't have any jurisdiction. They admitted that. They were basically saying, don't bother us with this. That's not my problem. But then we had the Las Vegas shooting. After the Las Vegas shooting, everybody went crazy. In fact, there's internal emails that have recently come out from the ATF's own internal communication, and these guys will admit that they were taking some serious heat during all of this. They were seeing people jumping on the ATF as to why did you allow these things? The ATF never allowed a bump stock. The ATF's letter, again, I will repeat this time and time again, the ATF was simply saying, we're not saying these are okay or they're not okay. We're just saying we have no jurisdiction. We have no grounds to make a ruling one way or the other. Okay, that was back then in 2010, and that was back then again last year after the Las Vegas shooting. Everything changed after that. Now look, folks, there's two ways to change a law. One is administratively by the president, and one is congressionally. The administrative one that's administered by the president is slow because since he's not using Congress and a group of elected officials and he's trying to make that ruling only on himself, there has to be a comment period on these gun laws. So that's why we had the comment period on the bump stocks that lasted until June, I believe, of this past year. All right. The other way is congressionally, where Congress has to pass these laws. That typically is a little bit faster. Congress can just go in there and propose a law, and if everybody agrees to it, bam, 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 it goes through, and the president signs it, and it's done. The process is much quicker. So that's why you heard Trump, whether he knew what he was doing or not, say that the ATF needed to do something. He was directing the Department of Justice incorrectly to tell the ATF that we need to have something to ban these things. So while he was buying some time and taking the slower road, he was kind of speeding things up because he was giving his Department of Justice the initiative to tell the ATF, I want a ruling on this. The NRA has taken some heat by supporting this bump stock ban. Let me tell you where the NRA was wrong, and it's going to be different than what some of you believe. The NRA was wrong to comment on this in the first place. They shouldn't have said a word. The NRA should have said, ATF, you stay out of it. You have no jurisdiction here. The NRA should not have said that the ATF should or shouldn't have done anything. Because again, they're implying that they have jurisdiction when you say that they should or shouldn't. The new publication by the ATF is actually the one that the gun bloggers put out. And this is kind of a precursor, a look at what is about to be proposed by the ATF. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read you some key points that I read in it. Now, remember the letter that I just told you about where they basically state that there's no moving parts, no functions, or I'll put it on the screen, that there's no parts that mechanically make these things, as these bump stocks, function. Keep that in mind when I read this new thing that they're about to be putting out on bump stocks. They're talking about how now bump stocks, when affixed to a firearm, allow that firearm to fire automatically with a single function of the trigger. They go on to say bump stock devices are machine guns, and then they say that's because such devices allow a shooter of a semi-automatic firearm to initiate a continuous firing cycle with a single pull of the trigger. Specifically, these devices convert an otherwise semi-automatic firearm into a machine gun by functioning as a self-acting or self-regulating mechanism that harnesses the recoil energy of the semi-automatic firearm. That completely and totally contradicts the original letter that they wrote in 2010. And if you put these letters side by side, the 2010 letter is still the correct one. This gun part, this gun accessory that we're calling a bump stock, does nothing automatically. There are no moving parts, so to speak. it's either locked together or it slides within itself. And when I say no moving parts, there's no mechanically moving parts. This is just a piece that moves back and forth. That piece can do nothing on its own. And let me tell you, it is not one pull of the trigger. The way you work these things is you pull with one hand and you push with the other hand. Your trigger is simply being kept, or your trigger finger is simply being kept stiff to ride on that trigger. You are doing all the work. You are pushing and pulling. If you stop pushing and pulling, the gun will stop firing. The gun cannot stop or start on its own. You have to be applying that pressure continuously, meaning that your gun, look, it may not be a conscious effort when you're pulling together. Let me show you what I'm talking about. When you are shooting these things, you are holding your trigger right here, your finger on the side of the trigger and the side of the bump stock. The bump stock is not the trigger. There's two things that your trigger finger is resting on. When you pull, you're never pulling the trigger. You never officially pull the trigger on a bump stock. You pull with this hand this way and you push with this hand forward. The trigger finger is simply locked in place by yourself. You basically bend your knuckle and leave it like that. This thing bounces on and off itself. This is based on the recoil. When you decide to stop pushing and pulling, you stop firing the weapon using the bump fire. So it is not one pull of the trigger. The trigger is officially never pulled. And if you want to count my pushing and pulling as the pulling of the trigger, so to speak, then you have another issue on your hand, because it's a different motion. In other words, I'm pushing and pulling every time. Like I said earlier, it may not be a conscious effort, but clearly, if I decide to stop pushing and pulling, I at that point am not pulling the trigger anymore, so to speak, by their terms. This needs to be kicked to Congress. This does not need to be left in the jurisdiction, the incorrect jurisdiction of the ATF. If they're going to try to rewrite the NFA in a definition of a machine gun to include this, that has to be approved by Congress. You can't just go in there and say, all right, I'm going to change this definition. They're not giving you the opportunity to keep these things. They're not going to be grandfathered in. You will have to turn these things into the government and they will destroy them. I've heard some people say, well, let's just make them an NFA item and now let the ATF regulate them because, hey, guess what? They'll get some money out of that. No, that's not how it should be. They don't need to regulate these, period. They don't have jurisdiction over that. So I'm not okay with saying, hey, let's find a way for us to keep these things. No, because that's us giving in. That's us giving in and saying, okay, ATF, you can have your jurisdiction over bump stocks. Just let me have one by letting me now pay my permission slip for my $200 tax stamp. Nope. Outside of that Second Amendment thing that we're struggling with over here, that again, I will tell you, bump stocks have nothing to do with the Second Amendment. If they regulate these things to where you can't legally have them, then what they're also doing is they're violating the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to show you the parts that it makes a difference on. That's the part where it says that you cannot be deprived of property without due process. The federal government cannot take your stuff without due process and compensating you for it. You bought those items legally, totally legally. You used your own money. You paid taxes. You paid taxes on those very items that your local and federal governments, depending on sales tax laws, wherever, profited from and made money from. Yet no one else is kicking in to reimburse you that. You cannot rob from law-abiding Americans. It's not legal. We have a constitution in place for a very good reason. You know, we talk about all these things that are being infringed upon us with the Second Amendment. When we start messing around with the Fifth Amendment and a bunch of these other amendments, not to mention 10th Amendment and some of the other amendments that are going to apply along the way with this thing, depending on how far enforcement actually goes, once we start tweaking things and allowing things to happen with all these other amendments, we're eroding the entire Constitution. When we ignore the phrases shall not be infringed and shall make no laws, we are treading into some really dangerous waters here. We are opening up the door to some very corrupt illegal activities that we are allowing our government to go out there and conduct. Guys, we can't be silent on this. Whether or not you support bump stocks is not the issue. You know my feelings on them. I think they're a gimmick. I think they're fun to shoot, but they're not practical. But you shouldn't be able to outlaw them. And I will never feel like it's okay to give any government agency, but especially the ATF, any more jurisdiction or right to control things that we legally purchase on our own and should not be regulatable than I can. And I'm going to stand firm on this, guys. I will stand with anybody that wants to take this to the next level. I will support anybody's lawsuit to say, and only if the lawsuit states that the ATF does not have the jurisdiction to outlaw these. I am not going to stand on the side of anyone that says we need to fight the ATF simply banning these. The fight we need to be having is not whether or not the ATF bans these or not. The fight we need to be having is that the ATF has no jurisdiction and they need to stay out of the business of gun parts. That has nothing to do with anything that's regulatable. They admit it themselves. To me, all of my attorney friends out there, I have Exhibit A from their June 2010 letter that they sent stating that they in fact had no jurisdiction over these things because they were gun parts.